Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar entitled Gun Violence in the Americas, Local Solutions to a Hemispheric Challenge. My name is Jeremy Biddle, and I'll be your moderator. Before we get started, a few words. First, today's webinar is the latest in a series organized through the Network to Prevent Gun Violence in the Americas, a diverse consortium of partners from multiple sectors who coalesce to raise the alarm on gun violence and its devastating effects. In this slide, you'll see some of the recent network webinars we've held, focused on everything from policy approaches to disrupt the flow of firearms, the role of the U.S. guns in fomenting violence against women in Mexico and Central America, assault weapons bans, and much more. Please visit the network site below to view past webinars or get the latest on upcoming events. Today's webinar is graciously hosted by the Consortium of Universities for Global Health. For the U.S. folks joining today, please check out CUE's Gun Control Tracker at the link on your screen to learn more about where your congressional representatives stand on gun control. Today, we'll explore a different facet of the gun violence tragedy in the Americas, shining a spotlight on the role cities play, not only in bearing a disproportionate burden of the gun violence epidemic, but also in driving innovation and change. This topic is especially timely and relevant now, as we're seeing an unprecedented surge in gun violence in cities across the US. But this is not just a US challenge. It's a shared challenge uniquely specific to this hemisphere, specific to this hemisphere's country, where over 250,000 global gun deaths each year happen in, of the over 250,000 gun deaths each year globally, 6 countries make up more than half, all of them in this hemisphere. It's also specific to this hemisphere's cities. This hemisphere is home to 47 of the world's top 50 most violent cities, with guns regularly accounting for upwards of 80% of all homicides, and specific even to particular subsets of its citizens, disproportionately affecting males, often young, oftentimes poor, marginalized, and from racial and ethnic minorities. For today's webinar, we'll hear from a stellar group of experts who each bring unique, complementary perspectives around the issue of gun violence that reveals that in many ways, in spite of obvious differences, the common challenge shares remarkably common solutions. You may notice that there's been a small change in the lineup. Rosanna Ander of the University of Chicago Crime Lab is no longer able to join us. We're fortunate to have Kim Smith in her place. After hearing presentations, we'll shift to questions and answers. So please send your questions via the chat feature in the GoTo application. And a big thanks in advance to our translators, Elena and Laura, for their simultaneous translation. Now, a quick overview of our lineup. Our first 2 presenters are Rodrigo Guerrero and Kim Smith. Dr. Guerrero is a surgeon, epidemiologist, and 2-time mayor of Cali, Colombia. And Kim is the director of programs at the University of Chicago Crime Lab. Both will speak to how cities like Cali and Chicago leverage data, evidence, and public health approaches to drive local policy and behavioral interventions to prevent gun violence. Following their presentations, we'll turn to Vaughn Crandall and Dr. Rodrigo Canales. Vaughn is the co-director of the California Partnership for Safe Communities, and Dr. Canales is an associate professor of organizational behavior at the Yale School of Management. Both will speak to the development and implementation of effective gun violence reduction strategies, sharing a unique split-screen case study of the experiences of Oakland, California, and Mexico City. To cap it all off, we'll hear from Sierra Walker, Executive Director of Live Free Chicago, who will speak to the last voice that's often heard, yet the first we should all be listening to, those of affected communities. Without further ado, Dr. Guerrero, we'll turn to you.
Are you listening me? I just want to be sure if I have if you have my first slide. Do you have it?
It's showing the back end. So at the top swap screens, it says.
At the top. At the top. No.
You can just go through your slides this way. We'll still see everything.
Okay, you have it. You have it part of the screen. So the first one is an introduction to Cali. Cali is a city of 2,500,000 people. It grew in the last 70 years from 135,000 to 2.5 million. It grew very rapidly. It's a migrant city pushed by economic reasons and violent reasons, as you will see. Then Cali is a violent city in a violent country, which is in a violent region. America's region is the most violent region of the Americas. Colombia is one of the most violent in the region, and Cali and Medellin are the two most violent cities in Colombia. So they are not typical. They may have some insights. I was mayor of Cali the first time. You see that one? Are you following now the slide?
Yes, sir. Yes, we could see it.
Okay. You have the homicide rates. Starting in 1938, we had 16 per 100,000. And then we had a peak in the 50s that was related to the political strife between the two parties that fought to be in power. And there was something like 300,000 people killed. Then there were a truce afterwards. And back in 1983, we had another big, higher peak that is related to drug traffic violence and political violence. Just to have you, the US rate is 5. So you can draw a line here, will be your homicide rate. Ecuador will be around 7. So back in 1936, we had a very high rate. We had 40 civil wars, political strife of national importance during the 19th century. So we have lived permanently, constantly in a violent environment, which is very prone to use firearms. Firearms in Colombia are made, manufactured, and sold by the army. So if you want to have a legal army, you have to go to the army and obtain a permit and use it. But as you can imagine, particularly during this period of the high drug traffic effort, we have the most sophisticated firearms in the world, some which were still on experimental use in the United States. Our drug traffickers were working with them. And then we have a local market. We are very skilled in manufacturing fire guns that work very effectively. So we have a mix. So we have in an environment that firearms are very abundant. Then we can move to this. This is the mortality rate due to homicides in the world. And then you have in this side, you see Latin American and Central. The blue line is homicides by firearms in men. In Latin American tropical, you see again the majority of the homicides in men in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, which is the most equivalent to us. And then in women, it's a similar area. So we are in an area that mortality due to homicide is very, very frequent and homicide. Then I was mayor the first time back in 1992. That was the peak of the homicide rate. Colombia at that time had 90, 89. Cali had 127 per 100,000. So we had really a very most dramatic influence. So at that time, we decided that we wanted to control violence using what we call the public health method, which is identify risk factors related to violent behavior and then work in each one of them. As it has worked very effectively, but availability of firearms was a very important risk factor, as you will see, and then alcohol consumption and cultural factors. Those were the three risk factors that relate to the use of firearms that I isolated. We also, for the general violence of the city, we have worked in the other risk factors, but I just want to concentrate on firearms, which is the purpose of this presentation. So we had risk factors associated with violence and prevention, availability of firearms. I already mentioned that we have to go to the army to get the legal, but illegal arms are, in some studies, 2/3 of the homicides are committed by illegal firearms. Alcohol consumption. We noticed that people that drink very heavily ended up in brawls, and frequently in this situation, people are killed because they have firearms. Cultural norms. I want to get back to the first. We have lived for 100 years in a permanent state of violence. I say that the guerrillas, the FARC, that just made a truce with the Colombian government a few years ago, for 70 years. And what they did, most importantly, in addition to the number of people they killed, is that they validated violence as a way to obtain a political purpose. So it's embedded in the Colombian culture to use violence to solve the problem. If you have a gun, then you have a risk factor for it. And then lately appeared the organized crime, the people related to drug traffic that always use highly effective ways. It can be discussed that firearms are not the only way to commit a homicide, but certainly the most efficient way to do it. Yeah, and that's why we ended up using highly sophisticated arms for violent crime. So what I did when I was the first time mayor of Cali, I noticed we did a study and we found that in homicide in Cali, 79% were committed by firearms, another by sharp objects, knives, another blunted strangulation, etc. We found that. Then we did measure in Medellin, which I put Medellin because Medellin and Cali have shared some of the risk factors. We found that 57% of 43% of the people killed in homicide had blood levels of 50 milligrams or higher, which they were drunk. So alcohol was related to that. What we did at that time, 1993, we based on this evidence, we decided to restrict alcohol sales in public places. Weekdays, stop alcohol selling at 2 a.m., on weekends at 3 a.m. It was a major uproar because it went against the Colombian culture, forbidding people to drink openly. And then we restricted firearm carrying permits that are given by the Army. On those high-risk weekends, we found that when payroll coincides with a Friday, workers receive their payments on a Friday, then we have an epidemic of killings in the weekend that follows. So on those high-risk days, Mother's Day, Halloween, New Year's Eve, we knew that there was high risk permit for homicide. So we decided to put a ban on that. When we did that, following the strict public health method, we evaluated what happened. It was a very interesting because we were able to, in a, almost a natural experiment, with the same population, all the change was the laws as to availability of alcohol and firearms. When we had the restrictive period, that was 2 a.m., stop selling alcohol, and then in some days it was at 3 a.m. and normally at 4 a.m. You can see the homicide rate, fire homicide rate had a close relationship. Alcohol was closely related to homicide by related to. Then we had, this is published in the literature, we evaluated what happened on those weekends in which we reduce, put the limit in hours for drinking alcohol. And in addition to that, we forbid the carrying of firearms. When those two measures, weekends in which we had those two measures put together, we have 35% less homicides in Cali. Given the brutal number of homicides, that was equivalent to something like 700 homicides could be avoided by having these two: restriction of alcohol and prohibiting people carrying firearms in Cali. So that was a very effective measure. It was developed and applied later in Bogota and many other countries, cities and countries. So we were able to document the relationship. And then the second, this is the homicide rate by type of firearm. This is the first administration. You can see that the blue line is the knife or bladed sharp object, but mostly a little bit higher. What this indicates, as we have learned now, that in brawls and people quarrels, like when people get drunk, they end up using less efficient knives or bottles, things to injure. But when organized crime drops in, then they switch to highly sophisticated armor. So you see the rates for firearms during this 26-year period, and the blue line is the to knife. The interesting thing is that in 2013, the national government finally accepted the a proposition that we have been made since the first time, that firearms could not be carried in Colombia, in Cali, at any time. They require a very highly complicated permission given by the Army. They finally agreed to put it in Cali. That was in 2013. As you can see, the drop in homicide rate by this prohibition of carrying firearms. And you can see in the blue line an increase in the rate of homicide by sharp objects, which could be called as a kind of reposition. People that could not kill using firearms, they went back to killing more with knives and all the typical things. But that was the effect of a normal regulation, effect of a regulation, the government. And then finally, I just want to mention briefly two examples of the cultural regulation of the firearms. The city of Bogota, with Antanas Bocus, the famous mayor, decided to launch a campaign and say, "Let firearms rest in peace." And so he began to go all over the city. Firearms should not be used. Then he said, which sounds very nice in Spanish, "Vida segura, armas a la basura," safe and to the junk. He invited people to give back their firearms were 588 that were given to them, ammunition 808. It's a very nice, nicely developed, very well harried, not formally evaluated, but there was an attempt to influence culture. And then finally, I just want to end by mentioning this, putting these two girls. I don't know how to get it. This one, I don't know how to get it. Well, it was these two girls, one coming from the eastern countries where they're having, and the one another in El Salvador, which is a girl with a handgun and a pigeon on her arms, which is, I just wanted to have it there because children are the ones that suffer most from all this grossly brutal environment. So that's for, I hope I have not gone beyond much of my 10 minutes. I hope I can answer some questions after. Thank you very much, Kim, back to you.
Thank you.
Did you listen? Did it was a did you listen to me, or I was talking, nobody listened, just for my feedback?
I was able to hear you, and I think my screen is visible to everyone. So
yes, yes,
great, perfect. In that case, hi everybody. My name is Kim Smith. I am the Director of Programs at the University of Chicago Crime and Education Lab. Here to talk to you today about some of our work, our model, and our theory of change. So to give you a little bit of background about our approach, our theory of change here at the Crime Lab is really to leverage private resources to carry out what we call demonstration projects or pilot projects with the public sector. And our ultimate goal is to help the government deploy its resources more effectively and humanely. We do that by working with government and the public sector, as well as nonprofit organizations, to identify promising programs and interventions. We then test those programs using experimental and quasi-experimental methods to understand the impact, and then we scale with the public sector if programs are found to be impactful. As a bit of background, in Chicago, the budget of our police department is $1.5 billion annually, and the budget of our education of the public schools is $5.5 billion annually. So we believe that if you can make either of those agencies either 1% or 5% more effective, you can really see transformational change in the impact of the lives of our city's residents. So that's some background on our theory of change. As a little bit more background, I wanted to talk about a program that we are currently evaluating and supporting the implementation of. And the program really came about following the surge in homicides in Chicago in 2016. So this figure is showing you the homicide rate, the number of homicides per 100,000 people in Chicago going back to the 1980s. And as you can see, following the peak of the homicide rate in Chicago in 1990, the city experienced a decrease pretty consistent with national trends. What we do see is an increase in 2016, and that was really a sharp and sudden increase. It was about 60% year over year, and an increase of that magnitude was really unseen and not really precedented in the data. So in addition to the incredibly tragic number of additional lives lost that year, it was a bit of a statistical anomaly. So that caused a lot of people to think about what we could be doing in response to the increase to ensure that we could blunt the increase and see Chicago where people were able to be safe and prosper. So following the 2016 increase in Chicago, one of the things that we did at the Crime Lab was look at some data to understand who was being victimized, who were the victims of shootings and homicides. So this figure here is showing you the age of shooting victims in Chicago in 2016. And what you can see is that 13% of the shooting victims in 2016 in Chicago were under the age of 18. That is the proportion of under 18 victims is quite consistent with what we see nationally in the United States. The number is actually a little bit higher in Chicago. And what was interesting is that most of the programming that's currently offered, the violence prevention programming in Chicago, is geared towards youth. Things like mentoring programs or summer jobs or after-school enrichment programs. And while those programs are incredibly important and we should have more of them probably to meet all the need in Chicago and elsewhere around the country, what we saw was that there was a service gap for 87% of victims. You can see that the majority of our victims are over the age of 18, and if we were intending to, as we wanted to in 2016, make a difference today, it was really important that those victims, the adults over the age of 18, were brought into the fold, and that we had services for them, because as things stood at the time, and it's still very much the case today, this population is really not being reached by existing services. So that realization led us to think about, what type of program might be effective and might contribute to an immediate reduction in gun violence. And prior research from the field of economics and elsewhere suggests that gun violence often stems from in-the-moment decisions made during high-stakes situations. Some of the evidence from the crime lab in particular, an evaluation of a program called Becoming a Man, found that cognitive behavioral therapy, programming that really encourages individuals to think about their thinking and to take a breath before they make a rash decision. Evaluations of those types of programs in Chicago suggested that they reduced violent crime arrests by 45 to 50% among participating youth. A study in Liberia of an 8-week cognitive behavioral therapy program for criminally engaged adults paired with a cash grant also saw dramatic reductions in violence among the participants, with effects lasting even beyond the program. So we have evidence from 2 different contexts that this therapy that encourages participants to think about their thinking does reduce violence involvement. We also found from research in Chicago that summer jobs seem to reduce violent crime arrests for participating youth by nearly 50%. And again, those effects lasted even long after the summer jobs had ended. So considering the body of evidence that has been growing in recent years, suggesting that cognitive behavioral therapy and jobs can reduce violence involvement, we and our partners were inspired to create a program called READI Chicago. So READI Chicago was launched in the fall of 2017, and it connects the individuals most at risk of being either victims or arrested for gun violence. It connects them with employment in paid transitional jobs, cognitive behavioral therapy, and supportive services. The program is it's based in 4 Chicago neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods where it's currently operating are those that contain a large share of the city's gun violence. So with READI Chicago, we are intentionally trying to identify and engage the individuals who are difficult to reach. We are trying to, it's a program for adult men, and it allocates up to 1 year of outreach to bring participants into the program. One thing we do know about the population of men who are likely to be involved with gun violence is that they are disconnected from many institutions outside of the criminal justice system. So referring back to my previous graph about the age of shooting victims, most programming is not designed for these men. So we knew it was not going to be an easy thing to identify them and engage them and keep them engaged in in this cognitive behavioral therapy and transitional jobs. So we intentionally bake in about a year of outreach to recruit participants. Participants, once we're able to engage them, receive approximately 2 years of programming. So they engage in 18 months of paid transitional employment. During that employment, participants work approximately 25 hours per week and spend approximately 15 hours per week in individual and group-based coaching and cognitive behavioral therapy sessions. After that 18 months, participants have access to an additional 6 months of case management and coaching support to help them transition to stable and unsubsidized employment. As part of the READI Chicago program, the Crime Lab is rigorously evaluating the program using a randomized control trial intended to understand the impact of the program on participants' violence and criminal justice system involvement, as well as employment outcomes. And as I said, we are really trying to target the program to the individuals most likely to be victims or arrested for gun violence. It is a very intensive program. We're not sure yet whether it works in the way that it's intended to. So we wanted to make sure that we were maximizing the impact of scarce resources. And so what you're seeing here is what the shooting and homicide victimizations per 100 people look like in a 20-month period in 4 different groups. So the top bar is the, per 100 people, the number of individuals in the READI participant group, control group, who are shot or killed. So 11 out of 100 of the READI control group individuals will be shot or had been shot or killed in the 20-month period. That is compared to 3.2 of 100 in the neighborhoods where the men were from. So if we subset for just men 18 to 34 in the neighborhoods where READI is operating, the rate of victimization is 3.2 per 100. If we look at all men in Chicago aged 18 to 34, that rate is 0.9. And then if we just look at the population of Chicago, it's 0.2 per 100. So as you can see, as we narrow down to the READI population, the READI group of men is experiencing rates of violence that are 3.5 higher than men in their neighborhoods and 55 times as high as the citywide rate. So we're confident that we're reaching the men who are most acutely at risk of being involved with violence, and we are able to engage them over a long period of time. The last thing I'll say for today, because the impact evaluation is still underway, so we don't have any results to report on yet, but what we are learning is a lot about the experiences of the men. As I said previously, the men are all over the age of 18. Most are between 18 and 32. The majority of participants are African American men, and many of the participants have served time in prison and have come into contact with the criminal justice system before. We also know that almost 80% of the men in the program have been a victim of a violent crime. 37% of them have been shot in the past. 3/4 have previously lost a family member to gun violence. Over half have children, and about 15% are experiencing homelessness or do not have stable housing. So when we think about not just the cognitive behavioral therapy and transitional job support that we're able to provide, but the number of other supports and barriers that these individuals face, it's really been important for us to consider how else we can support these men and empower them to live fulfilling lives and that are safe and prosperous. So with that, I will hand it over to Vaughn, but I would be happy to take questions about READI Chicago or any of the other work of the Crime Lab in Q&A.
Thank you, Kim. My name is Vaughn Crandall with the California Partnership for Safe Communities. I'm very grateful to be with you all today. In my 10 minutes, I'm going to cover a couple of things briefly, share a little bit of background on our organization, talk about the approach that we take in helping cities to reduce violence in the near term, and the research evidence that supports that approach. I'll share a little bit of the results from our work in Oakland, California over the last 9 years. And then as a transition to my colleague, Rodrigo Canales, I'll talk a little bit about some early lessons from our collaborative effort to apply these same approaches to a violence reduction effort in Mexico City, Mexico. So at the California Partnership for Safer Communities, our mission is to help cities advance what we think of as a public safety triple bottom line. We want to reduce serious violence, shootings and homicides, build police community trust, and achieve better outcomes for highest risk young people. And specifically, that means reducing the rates of violent victimization and incarceration for those that we identify at the very highest risk of imminent harm. We tend to engage in long-term partnerships with cities, 3 to 5 years, in some cases longer, to apply these evidence-based practices to these public safety problems. And in order to do this, we work in the following 6 areas. So first, we help cities understand their violence problem through an in-depth analysis, which I'll talk more about. We help them design a violence reduction strategy built from that analysis that convenes an array of public and private justice system and community partners around a shared definition of the problem. We help them engineer effective outreach and community intervention approaches that are specifically focused on this highest risk population. In order to have this partnership work effectively together, we have to do some trust building work between police and impacted communities. And so that is also a part of what we do with cities. Critically important is we also help cities and communities develop management systems that ground these strategies. So if we want to be effective on a problem like violence, we have to manage it more effectively. And so that's one of the things we do as well. And finally, we partner with outside research institutions to do analyses and impact evaluations of local efforts, and I'll share the results of that in Oakland. So really quickly, this sort of the basics of how we view this issue. You know, in the Americas, as Jeremy said in the framing, gun violence is the most serious problem we face in communities. There's many different ways we think and talk about that issue. In my organization, we know that you can do something about gun violence in the near term. This year, we can reduce violence on a community level. Our approach is not the only approach. There are other approaches that different communities and cities take, but I think there are some unifying themes across experiences. And I think Rodrigo and Kim's presentation also illustrate this. So one is a community needs political will that this is a top tier issue that's going to command resources and attention. And a critical mass of public and community leaders need to be on the same page about what they're going to do about it, about being aligned around a shared strategy. If that strategy is going to work, it really does need to have some evidence behind it. There are many things that we try that are well intended, but a lot of them don't work. Gun buybacks is one of the most famous examples of that. It makes total sense, and we know at this point it doesn't work at all. In order to advance an evidence-based strategy, though, we really need to understand the way violence works in a particular community. Thus, this analysis is critically important, and we have to ground our strategy in that analysis. We have to build devoted infrastructure designed to reduce violence in this community. And what we tend to find is both in the justice system and in community organizations, they are not tuned to and do not have devoted infrastructure to manage the problem of gun violence and to effectively engage very highest risk people right now. And so they need to develop that. And then lastly, but critically important, is those elected and public leaders and community leaders and the partners that move these strategies really do need to put themselves in a position of mutual accountability for results, by which I mean reducing shootings and homicides on a community level. And there's a lot of good stuff we can do, but at the end of the day, if shootings and homicides are not going down in this community, then we have to change what we're doing and we have to be accountable for that. So we tend to work from the focused deterrence, also known as Operation Ceasefire framework. And we do that for a couple of reasons. It's got the largest body of research evidence behind it. It's undergone 2 meta-analyses. It's been consistently shown to reduce community levels of violence as well as individual recidivism. So it does 2 things that we really care about. And it's also a really effective way to mobilize police, justice system, community, and social service actors to work together to reduce gun violence in the near term. It's super difficult because that's a lot of different stakeholders that need to be able to work together effectively. But when they can do that, the evidence shows that it's quite effective. This is just a brief representation of the most recent meta-analysis of focused deterrence and impacts. And generally what we find is, 1, that it works. And the second is that it tends to work best when it's focused on very highest risk networks. So just to sum up, I think all the research evidence, all the on-the-ground practice that I know of and familiar with says that if we're going to reduce violence effectively at a community level, we have to focus on people at the very highest risk of serious violence now. And we have to have a primary goal of reducing shootings and homicides. And as Kim was saying, I think our most effective interventions at this point are really decision-making interventions, right? And so community intervention approaches and focused deterrence type approaches that seek to change people's decisions in the near term about using violence as a way to resolve disputes is the place where it seems like we're able to have the most impact. So just briefly talk about how these principles and practices have applied in the context of Ceasefire Oakland, the Oakland Violence Reduction Strategy. We've been partnering with the City of Oakland since 2012 to develop and implement this. This is just a trend line of the Oakland homicide rate over the decade prior to our starting work with the city. This put Oakland as the most violent city in the state of California and one of the top 10 most violent cities in the United States. And Oakland has had a rate of serious violence that's been that high or higher for at least 50 years, as long as there's reliable records. And the city had tried many different things to address this problem. Youth curfews, gang injunctions. City spent over $100 million in basic prevention and outreach investments from about 2004 to 2012, only to have homicide go up by 40%. They had tried focused deterrence previously, but those were poorly designed efforts, and they'd done numerous waves of very aggressive zero tolerance type enforcement. And none of those things worked. And the basic reason is that they were not informed about a thorough analysis or understanding of the problem. They were not well managed, and they didn't constitute an effective joint citywide strategy. So when our organization started working with an array of community and city leadership in 2012, we convened a process to help design a strategy, and there were 3 goals that those stakeholders agreed to. They wanted to reduce shootings and homicides citywide. They wanted to make progress on a community level in Oakland in a way that would make a difference, a felt difference at the community level. They wanted to do it in a way that was not going to contribute to mass incarceration, so they wanted to do it in a way that was going to result in fewer arrests and better outcomes for highest risk people who are primarily men of color and specifically African-American men in between 18 and 35. And they wanted to do this in a way that was going to also strengthen police-community relations, because in spite of Oakland's incredibly difficult history between the police and communities of color, the people who are at this moment in time, in this moment of crisis, understood that the way forward was that they had to work together. So we started with this deep dive analysis of several years of homicides in the city of Oakland. And a common theme from the earlier efforts that hadn't worked was they were shaped by a certain view of the problem. And so what the public and community leaders and policymakers thought was that violence was driven by juveniles, people under 18, drug disputes, and economic motives. So this sort of goes to the point Kim was making about Chicago as well. And what the analysis reveals is homicide was primarily driven by specific running conflicts between high-risk groups and networks and personal disputes between people associated with those groups and networks. And that the average age of people involved in gun violence in the city of Oakland was 30 on average, that those folks had extremely serious justice system involvement. They had averaged a dozen prior arrests, and 7 of those were for felonies. And the vast majority of those folks were actively connected to street groups and networks that were in conflict with each other. And as opposed to what the public and community stakeholders thought, less than 10% of all homicides involved juveniles, and only about 13% had any connection to drugs. And so there's just a visual illustration. So we also stood up some management processes to look at every shooting in the city of Oakland every week to maintain this analysis over time. And essentially what that finds is in a city of about 420,000 people, in a given year, there are about 300 people in the entire city that rise to the level of risk of being likely to be involved in a shooting or homicide that year. And those are the people that we're focusing on. And the way that we focus on them really is by developing a management system that aligns the police department, community intervention partners, service organizations, and other community networks around a shared definition of the problem to act with urgency. So every week, the Oakland Police Department analyzes every single shooting in the city, to develop a analysis of the near-term priorities and very highest risk people. That analysis is shared with the Human Services Department, an array of community intervention partners in my organization, and that creates a near-term plan to intervene with specific people and specific networks for specific reasons to prevent retaliation shootings this week. Then that work is carried to a governance board of elected and community leaders, as well as agency heads, every 2 to 3 months, where our progress on shootings and homicides is reviewed next to our key program and intervention activities to ensure that we're making progress on violence this year. And the standard annual benchmark is that we want to reduce fatal and non-fatal shootings by a minimum of 10% every year, which is both like meaningful but achievable. And so here's the result of that work over time. So from 2012 through 2018, the city of Oakland has experienced over 50% reduction in shootings and homicides. Anthony Braga and his team from Northeastern University in Boston came in and did an independent evaluation of our work and found that the Oakland ceasefire strategy could specifically be credited with a 32% reduction in monthly gun homicides during that period of time. That's about 2/3 of that reduction could be directly attributed to Oakland ceasefire. It also found that our primary focus was these high-risk groups and networks, that our interventions reduced group and network involved shootings by 43% during this period of time. And also, while it's not in here, the other component of the evaluation looked at the outcomes for individuals and found that the individuals that we intervened with through this strategy had lower rates of arrest and lower rates of violent victimization compared to 2 different comparison and control groups. So as a transition to Dr. Rodrigo Canales, we've been working together for about the last 1.5 years to apply some of these same lessons and strategies in Mexico City, working in one community in Mexico City that he'll talk about, and just a couple of things I'll highlight from my experience as a transition to him. So one is we've done a similar analysis with his team in Mexico City, and what we find is the super concentration of risk is very similar, and the violence dynamics are actually very familiar. They look very much like pretty much any major US city you would look into around this problem. Somewhat differently is very little infrastructure exists to focus on these high-risk folks, both within the justice system and community and service stakeholders. That is also the case in many American cities, but it's a little bit different in Mexico City for some reasons he can discuss. Implementation remains super difficult. Focus and deterrence always requires a large array of partners to work together effectively. That's super hard to do. Some of the legal system and local government structures make that particularly hard there. True in any community, that impact and sustainability really requires organizational change. You want to change the way a city, the violence problem a city has, you have to change the way that a city works. And I think the bottom line for me so far is that the opportunities and challenges from what I've seen in Mexico City are more similar to US contexts than they are different. And with that, I'd like to transition to my friend and colleague, Dr. Rodrigo Canales.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Vaughn. I'll try to kind of provide some continuity over what you just said. Thank you, everybody, for having me here. I'm Rodrigo Canales, as I've been introduced already. I'm a faculty member at the Yale School of Management. For the past few years, I've been leading a project in Mexico looking at the question of how to build effective, resilient, and trusted police organizations in Mexico. And what's a little bit different about our approach is that we really do focus on kind of the organizational structure and dynamics of police forces. Like, we try to analyze police forces as organizations and then try to understand what are the kinds of structures, systems, processes, checks and balances that they need in order to do their work well. And so our project has kind of these 2 very big components. One component is analyzing kind of many police organizations to understand what it is about the organizational structure of more effective, more resilient, and more trusted police organizations that makes them different as organizations from less effective, less resilient, and less trusted police organizations. And so that's one big part of our analysis, where we kind of study many police organizations and compare them. And then the second big part of our work is looking at specific practices that have been shown to be effective in other places, and we try to understand how is it that an existing police organization can effectively weave those new practices into how they do things. And one of our kind of key interventions that we have incorporated into our project is the ceasefire or focused deterrence of violence intervention. And so that's what I'm going to be spending most of my time talking about today. So I'm going to kind of move relatively quickly through these slides. Now talk about kind of implementing ceasefire in Mexico City. It's basically trying to adapt all the principles that Vaughn just mentioned into the Mexico City reality. And so what makes Mexico different? You know, our justice system is different in many ways, but one critical way, for example, is that the police is not in charge of investigating crimes. Like, we don't have detectives within the police forces, but rather the district attorney's office, we could say, is in charge of doing all investigation, and then it's separated from the Ministry of Security. And so that creates a fundamental separation between prevention and investigation of crime. And, you know, anybody who's worked in any organization on the planet knows that, you know, when you have two competing agencies, they tend to have lack of trust between them. And so that's kind of one fundamental difference. The second is in general, across the region, and in Mexico is not the exception, there's lack of trust and credibility in institutions. And, you know, there's many instances of corruption and impunity for criminal impunity has been an issue for a long, long time. As I just mentioned, there's a culture of non-collaboration between institutions. They tend to be very territorial in what they do and in the information that they hold. And one challenge, obviously, is that we have criminal organizations in Mexico, and there are criminal organizations throughout the country, and Mexico City is not the exception. And so what did we do to adapt the model? Well, first, we spent a lot of time just understanding how it is that Vaughn and their team have been so effective in every city that they've worked with. And, you know, we visited their work, visited the cities that they've intervened. And then we decided that we first wanted to pilot the methodology in one specific neighborhood of Mexico City. And so, you know, we picked the 6 areas of Mexico City that had the highest concentration of gun violence, and then we ended up picking one to do a first pilot in. And based on that, and following Vaughn's advice and methodology, we kind of created a small work team and kind of an ad hoc work team that's been focusing on that area. And from there, we started this very gradual process of trying to change how they do things. As Vaughn said, if we want to change if we want to change the dynamics of violence, then everybody who works in the justice system needs to change how they approach violence. And that's obviously not an easy thing to do. By the way, if you were curious, in that picture, you see both Vaughn and me working with some of our Mexican partners. Vaughn is obviously the better looking and you know, fitter of the two. So the place where we've been testing this methodology is in Plateros. And it's a particular neighborhood of Mexico that has about 260,000 people live in it. And it's, you know, it's got one of the most stable and highest levels of gun homicide in the city. And following what Vaughn just mentioned, what we had to start with was this very careful identification of what exactly was happening with violence. Identical to what Vaughn described, if you had asked Mexico City officials what the problem was, they would say it's young kids killing each other over drugs. And so we said, okay, let's make sure that's the case. And so we started analyzing every single homicide that happened between 2017 and September 2019 in the area of Plateros. And in order to do that, we had to create a table, sort of a working group of crime analysts from the Mexico City Police, investigators from the Fiscalia, or the agency that's in charge of prosecution, people from the penitentiary system, people from like underground police that are actually on the beat in the Plateros area, right? And so we had to create this kind of work group that together analyzed every single homicide that happened in Plateros in the last 2 years, and every piece of information that every agency had about each of these individuals involved in each homicide. And we ended up identifying about 500 people involved in lethal violence throughout that period, and that includes victims and perpetrators. And basically what we discovered was exactly what Vaughn said. It was not about kids and drugs. It was actually much older people. And the vast majority of homicides were driven by disputes. And maybe in some cases, maybe the dispute did start over drugs or a particular territory for selling drugs. But by the point the second and third incident had happened, it wasn't no longer about that. It was about cycles of retaliation and cycles of settling disputes. This is kind of how steady the homicide rate has been in Plateros. And you can see that it's kind of this very constant rate of about 100 homicides per year. This tells you a little bit about how complicated it is to set up kind of these work teams, and why it's really critical to think of these interventions as interventions at the organizational level. We always describe the interventions as focusing on the people and the territories where we're intervening. Actually, the real intervention is in getting these organizations to work differently and to work together and to share the type of information that they need to share in order to identify the people most at risk and to identify what kinds of paths do we have to connect with them and what information do we have about them. Let me give you a quick example. One of the things that we discovered very quickly, which again also had happened in Oakland, is that once we identified these individuals, number one, the victims and the perpetrators are the same. There's no separation between victims and perpetrators. There's just this unending cycle of victimization and therefore retaliation. Number two, these were people that actually had a lot of contact with the justice system. Everybody had a lot of prior arrests. But because of the way the cases are analyzed in Mexico, and I think in most places, they were constantly falling through the cracks. Like, we hadn't identified that the same individual that was, a witness or a suspect for one homicide was actually the same person who we had arrested 5 times before for a variety of different reasons, including, for example, an incident of violence that we could have helped us predict that there was going to be a gun incident later on in time, right? And so once we brought all these actors to start sharing information, we realized, number one, all these connections that the people at highest risk had to the justice system, but also why they were constantly falling through the cracks, because we didn't have this integrated process to focus just on them. And just to make it a little bit more complicated, this gives you an idea of all the different individuals and actors that have to be involved. On the left, you have the justice component, meaning, the police, the prosecution, the penitentiary system, etc. And on the right, we have all the different actors that we've had to integrate to try and provide and design new service offerings that can reach these individuals. As both Kim and Vaughn had mentioned, a third discovery when you start analyzing all these people is that they have been left out of any kind of government program or government presence. They see themselves as living outside of the purview of government, and any program that currently exists is usually not well designed for them. They have very different needs, and so you need to figure out a way to catch them in their moments of vulnerability and try to work intensively with them to try and offer them a different approach. And so this is what the organizational setup ends up looking like. And I just want to raise the notion, like, why we emphasize so much that it is an organizational transformation. And it all started in our case with a very ad hoc and very informal, in terms of structure, but very formal in terms of their commitment, work group, where we quote unquote borrowed people from each of these necessary agencies. And we had them working together, meeting every single week to do this analysis of what the violence actually entailed. And the group has now been meeting for several months. And what's been really amazing is that as they have worked together and they've started to see all that they all learned when they all share information, they are now individually very deeply committed to the work. Of course, we couldn't have done this borrowing of people from the different agencies if we hadn't had the support from the mayor and the mandate from the mayor that we had to do this. And as we continue sharpening the mechanisms that allow this work group to function, we are beginning to now formalize it. But first we wanted to test what kinds of setups, what kinds of relationships, what kinds of information flows we needed to design for these different agencies to be able to collaborate with each other. And you know, I'm not going to go into details of, but basically where we are now is after identifying the key at-risk population, we've began testing the mechanisms to reach out to them and to send messages when needed. And we began also testing the mechanisms both on the enforcement side, but also on the services side. And again, at this stage is very experimental, but very focused, and like trying to bring all these different actors to co-design what could be a way of working with them. And so far, you know, we're moving forward better than everybody would have expected. And you know, we're because we are so convinced, and we've learned that the most critical element of making this work is the organizational transformation. A lot of our evaluation, especially at this stage, has focused on evaluating whether we're generating the type of organizational change that we need to generate. And so that includes kind of interviewing all the people who are involved, and then interviewing quote unquote structurally equivalent control people from their same agencies, just to see how their kind of way of understanding what it entails to share information with other agencies and what it entails to work with other agencies is changing. And we are indeed finding that as people participate in these things, they realize how critical interagency coordination for violence is, and how useful and critical a focused approach is, which obviously people who don't participate in these focused approaches tend not to realize. The last quick thing I'll mention is that, you know, we have found, as Vaughn said, that much more is similar than different to, for example, Oakland and the cities that Vaughn has worked in, and the cities that we've studied in our analysis before coming to Mexico City. The dynamics of violence are very similar, including the concentration of violence in groups and subgroups, and the characteristics of the individuals and their needs. The institutional rigidities, their starting points and the mindsets are very, very similar. What is different is the reliability, speed, and the nature of kind of the institutional levers that we can use in Latin America. And so, you know, institutional capacity varies a lot across agencies and across even units between agencies. And that's very different from the US, where institutional capacity is a little bit more even and more reliable across agencies. And so that means that we have to be much more creative, more patient, and more flexible in kind of designing, like if we don't have this, for example, this lever that is so useful in the US, for example, probation. Probation is a lever that is used very commonly in the US to kind of enforce a lever and then nudge people towards services to get them to change their behavior. Probation is not a lever that is very reliable in Mexico. And so we're having to kind of bring in a larger array of partners to think about, like, if probation is not something that we can use these individuals to pay attention, what are other things that we can use to bring them into the table and to get them to listen? And so that leads to kind of interesting and kind of creative experiments on what are ways to you know, get these individuals to pay attention and to try to bring them into a different set of services. So I'm going to stop now, and I'm going to thank you all for your attention. And I can't remember if I'm the last one or if I need to now transition to somebody else. But I think I've just stopped sharing, so I'm good. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sierra Bakes Chamberlain, the Executive Director of Live Free Chicago. Live Free Chicago is a part of Live Free USA, which is a national organization that mobilizes Black churches to address gun violence, police accountability, voter suppression, and decarceration. Locally, as the Executive Director of Live Free Chicago, we lead an initiative to address gun violence and mass incarceration through Black churches. And we do this through policy as well as preparing churches to actually go out and do intervention strategies. But today, I want to share more so on our policy side, on where we've been really working in the community to make sure that there are resources available for the type of intervention strategies that have already been discussed. And there are a number of organizations that's doing amazing work across Chicago an attempt to make sure that we're not only reducing the shootings and the homicides, but that we're also creating a better quality of life for people in Chicago and across the state. So one thing I want to get at, we've heard a lot of information and we heard a lot of great intervention strategies and programs, but the piece that I really want to hit on is that the fact that we're continually having to address these, we'll come up with our intervention programs. And Kim mentioned earlier in her slides how most of the people that they identified had already been some type of victim of violence or were incarcerated. It just had a number of issues that really show how they were also victims of society, or victims of the system. And so this is where we realize that violence is really a symptom of racism, poverty, and neglect. And in order to really address the root causes of it, that we have to begin to address the policies that are marginalizing and oppressing Black and Brown communities. So for example, in Chicago, where over 80% of the homicides are Black men and women, we really have to ask that question: what are we doing to improve the quality of life and addressing those policies? So we had the opportunity back in 2017 to travel with Live Free USA and to work with the Crime Lab, and we learned a lot about what other folks were doing across the country. And one thing that we realized back in 2017 is that looking at 2016, that in Chicago, we had at the time 762 homicides. In New York and Los Angeles, being larger in population, their homicide numbers were tremendously lower than ours. And one thing that we learned was that they both had Office of Violence Prevention in their cities. And so that sparked our organizers and our faith leaders to say, okay, well, where is our Office of Gun Violence Prevention? And so we did some research, and when we came home, we noticed that we had an Office of Violence Prevention, but this Office of Violence Prevention was in the Public Health Department. It had a $2.4 million budget, and it focused on cyberbullying, teen dating, and some other things that was not necessarily targeting gun violence prevention, which was a huge alarm for us, because in the city where there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of young Black and Brown men and women that are dying every year, why is that such a tiny investment into, again, where there's a huge problem in the city? And again, to us, in addressing the violence, the root causes of it, it all goes back to how we're resourcing our communities. Because when we're thinking about the issues of over-policing and incarceration and healthy food and affordable housing, again, our communities, meaning Black communities and Brown communities, are deeply under-resourced. And so, for example, when we have a $1.7 billion policing budget, and then there was also a report released on the west side of Chicago over the past 5 years, there's one block, not a neighborhood, but there's one block where there was over $4 million spent to incarcerate people on that one block. So clearly there is, we're misguided by where money should be spent. And there's a lot of money spent in over policing Black and Brown communities and incarcerating Black and Brown communities. So we developed a campaign to create an Office of Violence Prevention in Chicago. And so at the time, and currently during this time, there's still this battle between what approach to take. And it's the common approach to say we're going to hire more police, invest in more punitive approaches, and support policies and practices that criminalize Black and Brown people. And over time, we've been hearing that we have to use public health approaches to address gun violence, yet we're still seeing the approaches to invest in policing and to send more police out on the streets. And we know that this tactic of law and order is not what's going to work to, one, to intervene in the violence, or to actually break the cycle of violence in Black and Brown communities. So our campaign focused on creating this office And we wanted to do it through an ordinance so that this office would be a part of the city structure. So we created an ordinance, and this ordinance would direct funding toward communities most impacted by gun violence. So in Chicago, there are 77 neighborhoods, and over 60% of the shootings and homicide takes place within 15 of those neighborhoods. So we want to make sure that funding is directed toward the neighborhoods most in need. And there will be a coordinated strategy that is transparent to the public. And in this strategy, it will make sure that resources, again, going back to making sure that resources are invested into communities to improve the overall quality of life for individuals, because we want to stop getting to the intervention portion to where we're actually able to prevent these things from happening. So we want to improve the quality of life and make sure that people have access to mental health resources and have access to employment. And then those who are in need of intervention strategies also have those programs available to them. But again, $2.7 million or even, well, now they've invested a few more $1 million in it, but it's still going to require a huge amount of funding to actually invest into strategies that work. And so this sort of leads us to our piece on when we're talking about what will it take to actually reduce violence and sustain it in our communities. We're really going to have to rethink of how we're allocating funding and how do we reimagine policing. And so I wanted to bring up the point of why we say defund the police. And we say this because we're not, at this point, I don't speak as one to say that we're going to completely just abolish the police and work without any form of police. But we are saying with the $1.7 billion, that needs to be a drastic amount of money reallocated toward community services. So the mayor in New York came out with a bold statement of saying that he would move about 16% of their budget to social service agencies. And this is the type of reimagining that we need to see, again, to actually make sure that we're not constantly putting Band-Aids on a wound that we will never see heal. Our goal is to make sure that the wound is healed so that we can get to a point where we no longer need the Band-Aids. And with that being said, this is our approach to continually demand that there are resources, that there are dollars that are actually being invested into communities to address the root causes of violence. And I'll pass it over to Jeremy.
Thank you so much, Sierra. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. I really think that this was a well-rounded, really interesting discussion. I hope that those on the line feel the same way, where we hit on a number of the kind of common themes that really surround successful approaches and strategies to reducing gun violence at a local level: leadership, coordination, non-traditional partnerships, implementation, research, and advocacy. So now, with the little time that we have left, and I don't know if it's a hard stop, but I know that some of our presenters are going to have to go, I'm just going to turn to a few of the questions that we've gotten from the audience. We could start with one that's directed to Dr. Guerrero, which asks, how are the prohibition on carrying firearms in Cali, whether temporary or permanent, enforced by authorities? And Dr. Guerrero, if you can just give a brief response, we can hopefully get through a few of these questions before we all break. Thank you. We might be having some microphone issues. So in the interim, we can come back to Dr. Guerrero after we resolve. Oh, you're okay there? Okay.
Okay, so I will just going to, I am muted. That's my problem.
I think we can all hear you now.
Okay, you can hear me?
Yes,
You
loud and
cannot?
clear.
Okay, I just wanted, I couldn't stop from thinking as I listened to this presentation that there is a common element of all of them. It's starting from observation of reality. And this, to me, is the most important component. I have the privilege of being mayor of Cali in 25 years interval. And the risk factors were different. Initially, once I showed alcohol and brawls were the most important cause of death. The second time, a few years ago, was organized crime. So that's just to mention that. So going back to the prohibition of carrying firearms, I just want to say firearms are manufactured and distributed by the Army, and so they have the privilege of granting permission to carry firearms. The first administration, I managed to convince them to make it two categories. One, to have a firearm at home, which was more or less easy to get it. And one was very strict, to carry firearms. So that was enforced by the Army. Then, of course, the enforcement is very difficult because you may have you have to be caught, and then all kind of difficulties occur. But then, as I showed, when Cali in 2013, the central government banned the carrying firearms, we had a reduction in the homicide rate of firearms. So to some degree, it works, but it's very difficult to implement and to evaluate.
Thank you very much. Going on to our next question. And this one is for Dr. Canales. The question reads, I was struck during the presentation on Mexico City that perpetrators and victims were the same people. Is this also the case in femicides?
Okay, I was having trouble unmuting myself. Thank you. So two things. Number one is obviously not. Femicides tend to be the vast majority of femicides are carried out by people who the woman knows, and most often the romantic partner. And so it's a very different dynamic. Interestingly, the focus deterrence approach there seems to be evidence that the focus deterrence approach also works for these kinds of homicides, but it's a slightly different analysis because the dynamics are different, right? Like whereas in prototypical gun violence, which is the one that we're focusing on, these are networks of individuals who are in cycles of retaliation. In domestic violence or femicides, it's a different issue, which is it's less driven by networks and it's more driven by certain individuals who tend to be more violent. And so it is not true that the victims or the perpetrators are the same when you're talking about femicides. But femicides, I don't want to understate the criticality of femicides. I think it's a horrible problem, and there needs to be much more attention to it in a similar way where we need to have a focused approach. And I think it's very important to separate them. That's exactly why it's important to understand the origins and the types of violence so that you can separate and say, like, well, for example, in Plateros, if 60 or 70% of our homicides are being driven by these violent groups, then let's have this focused intervention on them. And there are areas in Mexico, Plateros is not one of them, where let's say 20% of homicides or 15% of homicides are femicides. Then let's have another focused intervention that focuses on these other people, right? But what is critical is this idea of each of these types of violence is driven by a particular dynamic, and we need to understand it, and we need to have a focused approach. Because what I do think remains true across the different types of violence is that there are very, very few people who are driving the vast majority of violence. And so having a focalized approach that really understands who are the people most at risk of either committing or being the victims of violence, it's that type of focus that can really help you rally the resources and have the type of continuous engagement that both Kim and Vaughn described that is required in order to begin to change people's behaviors.
Thank you so much. Going on to our next question, and I think I don't want to take advantage of anyone's time, but if we go another 5 or 10 minutes, we could squeeze in maybe 2 additional questions. Next question is for the US speakers. What is your response to renewed efforts to defund the police? And if that were to happen, how might it impact your work, for better or worse?
This is Vaughn. I'm happy to give an initial reaction. I think that I would first refer to Sierra's presentation. I thought that was excellent. I do think it's an effective capture of the issues that are at play. You know, personally and professionally, I agree with a lot of that, what the defund movement is calling for and the critiques that they're raising. Communities of color have been over-policed and underprotected. The evidence is very clear on that. I think what I would say is, I also agree with her that I think the calling for the abolition of police is both, in my perspective, not realistic, but I also think potentially destructive to the conversation. But in any case, I think the version of that can do what we want in the sense of building a greater sense of justice locally, reducing serious violence, reducing the negative footprint of the justice system, and further empowering communities that are impacted is take a look at police organizations. There are a bunch of things police organizations do now that could probably be better done by other entities, like non-criminal calls and incidents, low-level criminal calls and incidents, where you don't need an armed uniformed officer to respond, or at least be the first responder. But I think there's other components of police organizations that do need to remain, and frankly do need more support. And particularly that would be the parts of police agencies that respond to and investigate serious and violent crime. And so I think I like to think about it as, in some sense, a reimagining conversation where some significant share of, sort of current police organizations could be vested in non-enforcement or community entities, and then some significant share of the policing that remains is improved, particularly around the investigation and solving of serious violence. And I think the only thing that I'd say around the political dynamic is I think that is hard long-term work. And I think what we're going to end up with is something, if we can hold people through that process, something more like a cross-functional team that includes police as one player with a larger range of community entities, rather than sort of the police having no role. And for example, in many mental health situations, a lot of mental health organizations say like, hey, there are certain calls that I need an officer to be present. I can't effectively work in this situation. But there's a bunch of calls in which they don't. And so anyway, I guess that would be my comment. I think the defund reimagine call is super important. And I think there's something important in there for all of us to consider.
Thanks so much, Vaughn. Kim, Sarah, does either one of you want to offer any other words?
Yeah, this is Kim. I think the only thing I would add to what Vaughn said, which I completely agree with, is the idea that there has been a lot of evidence and research over the years which suggests that police can be quite effective at controlling violence. But to Vaughn's point, there are incredible social costs that come along with using law enforcement as the primary mechanism by which we try to reduce violence. And there is a growing body of evidence suggesting that alternatives to policing can be effective at maintaining public safety without all of the harmful costs associated with the criminal justice system. And in addition to, identifying what those alternatives are, I think focusing on the things that the police are uniquely well suited to do, while also supporting training and efforts to increase their ability to constitutionally police and engage appropriately with citizens, does seem to be one incredibly high priority initiative. So I think a world in which we're both able to reduce violence and reduce the harms of the criminal justice system doesn't seem, those two things don't necessarily seem mutually exclusive. And I think a lot of what we're doing at the Crime Lab is trying to understand, the intersection of the two as quickly as possible.
Thanks so much, Kim. Sierra, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Are you listening to me? I would like just make a brief comment. Are you
Sure.
listening? Given the thing that I was mayor 20 years apart, and I have spent most of this period devoted to prevention of violence. First, the importance of reliable information. All organizations, we should be very careful to provide to the public information about rate of homicide rates, firearms, all this information, because is the only way governments, mayors can be made accountable of things that are happening. That's one reflection that I have learned. The second one is, the other one is the importance of culture. This is an ill-defined term that tends people to react violent in the given situations. And our case in Colombia, as I mentioned at the beginning, is a most important factor. And this is the most difficult part to mention. Again, thank you very much for inviting me. Excuse me for my English that was especially broken today, but I hope to do better next time.
No need to apologize. Your English is beautiful.
And this is Sierra. I just wanted to add that, yes, I think that the defunding or the significant shift or reallocation of funding into social service or community-based strategies will be extremely helpful to our work. And I think more so not only because there'll be funding to invest into the community-based strategies that we believe to be more effective, but it also will begin to shift in the culture on why government is so heavily reliant upon incarceration and policing strategies when dealing with the social issues in Black and Brown communities. So I think it's a huge piece of it is about a cultural shift and how we govern our communities.
Thank you so much, Sierra. I don't think, unfortunately, that we have time for any additional questions. I know that we have a hard stop at 2:30. I just want to take one quick second to thank everyone who served on the panel, everyone who presented. I'd like to also thank our organizers, CUGH, and Jenna in particular. I'd like to thank the Medical School of Wisconsin, Tiffany, Dr. Hargarden, and also our translators, Elena and Laura, and for everyone who joined the line and took the time to join this conversation and ask questions. Thank you so much, everyone. And please check out the Network for the Prevention of Gun Violence's website for any upcoming events. And again, really appreciate everyone's taking the time to join.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.